I just like the sound of it.
Wet, wet, I'm talking wet, wet. Wet, wet, my neck is wet, wet. Wet, wet, my wrist is wet, wet. When I walk in this club, bitches wet, wet. Wet, wet, I'm talking wet, wet. Wet, wet, my neck is wet, wet. Wet, wet, my wrist is wet, wet. When I walk in this club, bitches wet, wet. I'm the wet, 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 wet. Crest, crest. All those logos on my tees, it's a bless. I dress to the party waters just to impress. Timid smoking sense and make a nigga eat less. Timid beef now make your money coming less. It's about statistics, it's about common sense. Don't mess with my currencies. MLB round table when we conversate. If you ain't about the life, nigga lift the raise. I'm about to put the game on a new pace. Pesos, I'm talking pesos. Picture me in the raid smoking gelatos. Middle finger to the pussy niggas in the hoes. More-time billionaire hitting toes. Right now we killing play and it's case closed. It's case closed, cause I said so. Wet, wet, I'm talking wet, wet. Wet, wet, my neck is wet, wet. Wet, wet, my wrist is wet, wet. When I walk in this club, bitches wet, wet. Wet, wet, I'm talking wet, wet. Wet, wet, my neck is wet, wet. Wet, wet, my wrist is wet, wet. When I walk in this club, bitches wet, wet. You can call me wet, or slippery. I ain't down for the shit, others fuckeries. We're straight from the Wild West, dungarees. You talking about moolah, you can talk to me. I ain't down for the gossip in the companies. Generation now, well-built companies. If you're talking to the police, don't talk to me. If you wanna be a hustler, need a Tony. It's a dream getting paper just like Tony Montana. I ain't talking about Frank Montana, I'm talking about Tony Montana. Salvin cook to Americanos, Naco route to Savannah. Solving by the lows, I'm talking green gold. Do it big for the legacy of Pablo. And if you don't, you know who else? El Chapo, king of the tunnel. Why you using cargos?
I just like the sound of it.
Wet, wet, I'm talking wet, wet. Wet, wet, my neck is wet, wet. Wet, wet, my wrist is wet, wet. When I walk in this club, bitches wet, wet. Wet, wet, I'm talking wet, wet. Wet, wet, my neck is wet, wet. Wet, wet, my wrist is wet, wet. When I walk in this club, bitches wet, wet.